While her cousins inherited sprawling estates and dripping diamonds, Lydia endured a will reading that was a masterclass in cruelty. She was handed nothing but a rusted, dirt-caked lockbox. The family laughed, deeming it a fitting prize for the outcast, but their mockery died the moment those corroded hinges finally snapped open. The mahogany-panelled library of the Harrington estate smelled of floor wax, stale cigar smoke, and impending greed. Rain lashed against the towering stained-glass windows, casting warped, colourful shadows across the faces of the surviving family members. Lydia Jenkins sat as close to the door as politely possible, her damp wool coat pulled tight over her shoulders. She felt like an intruder in her own family's ancestral home in Newport, Rhode Island. At the head of the heavy oak table sat Thomas Abernathy, a senior partner at a prestigious New England law firm. He was adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, clearing his throat with a sound like grinding gravel. Surrounding him were the true heirs of great-aunt Beatrice Harrington, Lydia's Uncle William, whose tailored Italian suit probably cost more than Lydia's annual rent in Boston, and her cousin Cassandra, who was busy tapping a French manicured nail against the screen of her phone, clearly bored by the formalities. Great-aunt Beatrice had been a formidable, deeply eccentric woman. While the rest of the Harringtons built their wealth on real estate and ruthless corporate acquisitions, Beatrice had spent her life traveling, collecting obscure art, and living as a recluse in the sprawling Newport mansion. She was the only Harrington who had ever bothered to send Lydia a birthday card after Lydia's mother passed away, leaving Lydia drowning in medical debt. Beatrice had always possessed a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, and Lydia had loved her for it. But love in the Harrington family was not a currency that traded on the open market. "If we could proceed," Thomas Williams said, shooting his Rolex a significant look. "Some of us have flights to catch. I need to be in London by tomorrow evening." "Of course, William," Mr. Abernathy replied, smoothing the thick cream-coloured parchment of the will. "I will skip the standard boilerplate and move directly to the distribution of assets." Lydia stared at her scuffed boots. She didn't expect anything. She had only attended to pay her final respects to the woman who used to sneak her lemon drops during suffocating holiday dinners. "To my nephew William Harrington." Abernathy read his voice, taking on a formal, booming cadence. "I leave the Newport estate its grounds, and the entirety of my liquid assets currently held in the primary offshore trust." William didn't even blink. It was expected. He gave a curt nod, a ghost of a smug smile playing on his lips. "To my great-niece, Cassandra Harrington," the lawyer continued, "I leave my complete collection of jewellery, including the Cartier diamond suite and the sapphire parure inherited from my grandmother." Cassandra finally looked up from her phone, a genuine predatory grin spreading across her face. Finally. She kept those locked in a vault for 40 years. What a waste. Abernathy paused. He looked down at the parchment, then over the rim of his glasses, his eyes landing directly on Lydia. The silence in the room suddenly grew thick and oppressive. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, counting the seconds of Lydia's mounting anxiety. And finally, Abernathy said, his tone softening just a fraction, "To my great-niece Lydia Jenkins, I leave the iron lockbox recovered from the eastern attic and its contents." William frowned. "An iron box. What iron box?" Abernathy signalled to an assistant standing quietly in the shadows. The young man stepped forward, carrying something that looked like it belonged in a shipwreck rather than a billionaire's estate. With a heavy thud, he set it down on the polished mahogany table. It was a nightmare of oxidized metal. Roughly the size of a large shoebox, the iron was thick-pitted and completely covered in a flaky dark orange rust. It looked heavy, archaic, and utterly worthless. A massive rusted padlock hung stubbornly from the front clasp. Cassandra let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You have got to be kidding me." Aunt Beatrice gave her a box of scrap metal. The stipulations of the will are clear, Abernathy said strictly. William chuckled a low, condescending sound that made Lydia's stomach churn. Well, Lydia, it seems Beatrice knew exactly what you were capable of managing. Don't strain your back carrying your inheritance to the subway. Is there a key? Lydia asked, her voice quiet but steady, refusing to let them see her humiliation. I'm afraid not, Miss Jenkins, Abernathy replied. The late Miss Harrington specifically noted that you would need to find your own way inside. Those were her exact words. Cassandra leaned over, pretending to inspect the rusted monstrosity. Careful, Lydia. You might need a tetanus shot just to open it. Knowing Beatrice, it's probably full of mothballs and old sewing needles. A fitting prize for the family charity case. Heat flared in Lydia's cheeks. She stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She didn't say a word to her uncle or her cousin. She walked over to the table, wrapped her arms around the freezing, abrasive metal of the box and lifted it. It was shockingly heavy, easily pushing 40 pounds. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy, Lydia said, her voice tight, as she walked out of the library, the heavy oak doors closing behind her. She could hear William and Cassandra erupt into genuine, unrestrained laughter. They were laughing at her. They were laughing at Beatrice's final, cruel joke. But as Lydia stepped out into the freezing Rhode Island rain, lugging the rusted iron weight against her chest, a strange, burning determination took root in her chest. Beatrice was eccentric, yes, but she was never cruel. There was a reason she had given Lydia this box, and Lydia was going to find out what it was. The ride back to Boston was a miserable ordeal. Lydia's arms ached from hauling the 40-pound iron box onto the commuter train, and the rusted bottom had left a nasty brown stain on her only decent winter coat. When she finally dragged it up the 3 flights of stairs to her cramped, drafty apartment in Somerville, she was exhausted freezing and beginning to wonder if William had been right. She dropped the box onto her scratched kitchen table with a heavy thud that rattled her mismatched coffee mugs. Under the harsh fluorescent light of her kitchen, the box looked even less promising. There were no hidden engravings, no secret family crests shining beneath the grime. It was just a brutally ugly block of oxidized iron. The padlock on the front was massive, the keyhole completely fused with decades of corrosion. For the first 3 days, Lydia tried everything. She sprayed an entire can of WD-40 into the mechanism. She took a hammer to the shackle, hitting it until her hands blistered and her neighbors banged on the ceiling with a broom. She even tried wedging a heavy-duty crowbar under the lid, but the iron wouldn't give a single millimeter. The box was practically a bank vault. By Friday, her frustration peaked. She had skipped 2 freelance design deadlines, just obsessing over the rusty cube. Refusing to be beaten, she searched online and found a local old-school locksmith named David Miller, who ran a dusty little shop down in the North End, specializing in antique safes and complex mechanisms. Lydia bundled the box into a canvas tote bag and lugged it to David's shop. The bell above the door jingled, and David, a man who looked as weathered and sturdy as the locks he fixed, peered at her over a pair of thick magnifying glasses. I need this opened, Lydia said, heaving the box onto his counter, without destroying the contents inside. David whistled, running a calloused thumb over the rusted padlock. That's a mid-19th century Chubb detector lock. British-made. They were designed to lock up tighter if someone tried to pick them with the wrong tool. And judging by the rust, this hasn't been opened since the Nixon administration. Can you do it? Lydia asked, holding her breath. Give me an hour, David muttered, already pulling a roll of strange, delicate-looking tension wrenches from under the counter. Lydia spent the next hour pacing the snowy sidewalk outside her heart, hammering against her ribs. What if it was just sewing supplies? What if Beatrice really had lost her mind at the end, and the entire inheritance was just the delusions of a dying woman? The laughter of her cousins echoed in her ears, making her feel small and foolish. Finally, David waved her back inside. He was wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. The massive padlock sat on the counter, its shackles successfully popped open. "Toughest mechanism I've fought in a decade," David said, grinning. "That'll be $80, kid." Lydia happily paid him with money she couldn't afford to spend, packed the unlatched box back into her tote, and practically sprinted to the tea station. When she returned to her apartment, she locked the deadbolt behind her. She set the box on the kitchen table. The moment of truth. With trembling hands, she grabbed the rusted lid. It shrieked in protest, a terrible metallic grinding sound, as she forced it backward on its hinges. A cloud of stale, musty dust puffed into the air. Lydia coughed, waving the air clear, and peered inside. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Inside the deep iron cavity lay a scattering of absolute junk. There were a half-dozen dried, crumbling roses, their petals completely brown and turning to dust. Beneath them lay a small stack of letters bound in twine, a tarnished brass thimble, and 3 smooth river stones. Lydia felt the air rush out of her lungs. She reached in her hands, shaking, and pulled out the letters. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. She untied the twine and read the top letter. It was a grocery list from 1982. The next was a faded receipt for potting soil. The last was a postcard from someone named Brenda, thanking Beatrice for a lovely afternoon tea. There was no money, no hidden diamonds, no stock certificates. Cassandra's mocking voice echoed in her mind. A fitting prize for the family charity case. Tears of hot, bitter frustration pricked Lydia's eyes. She had hauled this heavy, filthy thing across state lines. She had paid a locksmith her grocery money. She had allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope, hope that her great-aunt had truly cared about her, hope that she could finally pay off the crushing medical debt her mother had left behind. "You stupid idiot," Lydia whispered to herself, wiping a tear angrily from her cheek. She picked up one of the river stones and threw it across the room. It clattered uselessly against the baseboard. Furious, Lydia grabbed the heavy iron box, intending to haul it out to the apartment building's dumpster right then and there. But in her anger, she misjudged the weight. As she hoisted it off the table, the box slipped from her sweaty grip. It plummeted toward the floor. Lydia jumped back just in time to save her toes as the 40-pound iron block slammed into the cheap linoleum floor with a deafening crack. "Damn it," Lydia yelled, dropping to her knees to inspect the damage to her floorboards. But as she reached for the box, she froze. The impact of the fall had done what the crowbar could not. The thick iron bottom of the box inside the cavity had dislodged. It was sitting at an awkward angle. Lydia frowned, her breath catching in her throat. She reached a trembling hand into the box and pressed against the tilted iron plate. It moved. It wasn't a solid bottom. It was a false floor. Carefully, Lydia wedged her fingernails under the edge of the heavy iron plate and pulled it upward. It lifted away, revealing a hidden compartment barely 2 inches deep. Resting inside the dark, untouched space was a pouch made of deep crimson velvet, miraculously preserved from the rust and decay. Next to it lay a single crisp envelope. The parchment was pristine, sealed with a pool of dark red wax bearing the Harrington family crest, and written across the front in Beatrice's unmistakable elegant cursive were 3 words, "For Lydia's eyes." Lydia's hands shook so violently she could barely break the wax seal. She pulled out the thick letterhead. "My dearest Lydia, if you are reading this, it means you had the perseverance I always knew you possessed. I knew William and Cassandra would laugh at the iron box. I counted on their arrogance. They look only at the surface of things, blinded by immediate gratification and shiny objects. They will squander the estate within a decade. But you, my dear girl, you know how to look deeper. The trinkets above were a necessary decoy to protect this secret in case the box fell into the wrong hands before it reached you." Lydia set the letter down for a second, her pulse roaring in her ears. She picked up the crimson velvet pouch. It was heavy. She loosened the drawstrings and tipped it into her palm. Out slid a key. But it wasn't a normal key. It was long, heavy, and made of solid, gleaming gold, the bow intricately carved with the shape of a lion's head. The teeth of the key were complex and strange, unlike anything David the locksmith had in his shop. Lydia quickly picked the letter back up and continued reading. This key belongs to Safety Deposit Box 804 at the Manhattan Historical Trust Bank in New York. The account is under a name the rest of the family knows nothing about. Inside you will find the Carnegie Ledger and the true foundation of the Harrington wealth. It belongs to you now. Do not trust your uncle. Do not tell a soul. With all my love, Beatrice. Lydia sat on the linoleum floor of her tiny kitchen, the solid gold key heavy in her hand, staring into the empty void of the rusted box. Her life, she realized with a terrifying thrill, had just changed forever. Lydia didn't sleep a wink that night. She sat at her scarred kitchen table, staring at the solid gold key and the elegant, heavy parchment of Beatrice's letter. By 5 a.m., she was on the first Amtrak train out of Boston, watching the frozen New England landscape blur past her window. She carried nothing but her leather satchel, the key tucked safely into an interior zippered pocket, resting directly against her ribs. When she arrived at Penn Station, the sheer scale of New York City threatened to overwhelm her. She navigated the crowded subway cars down to the financial district, stepping out into the shadows of towering skyscrapers. She walked down Broad Street, past the iconic facade of the New York Stock Exchange, her boots splashing in shallow, icy puddles. Just 2 blocks away, tucked between modern glass high-rises, sat the Manhattan Historical Trust. It was an imposing fortress of grey granite and heavy wrought iron. There were no flashing digital screens, no friendly window displays. It looked less like a bank and more like a mausoleum for old money. Lydia pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors. Inside, the air was hushed and smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and wealth. Corinthian marble columns stretched toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with faded frescoes of industry and commerce. She approached the main mahogany desk, where a distinguished older man in a 3-piece suit was inspecting a ledger through a tortoise-shell monocle. "May I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone polite, but laced with the subtle implication that she was lost. Her scuffed boots and damp wool coat starkly contrasted with the bank's opulent interior. "I need to access a safety deposit box," Lydia said, her voice remarkably steady. "Box 804. The man's posture shifted instantly. The mild dismissal vanished, replaced by sharp professional attention. "Of course. And under what name is the account registered?" Lydia remembered the final lines of Beatrice's letter. "The account is under a name the rest of the family knows nothing about." Before she died, Beatrice had murmured a story to Lydia about her favorite poet, a woman named Constance, who had defied high society. "Constance Whitney," Lydia said confidently. The man typed quietly on a heavy mechanical-looking keyboard. He paused, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Very well, Miss Whitney. I am Arturo Pendleton, the senior vault manager. If you possess the primary key, I will escort you downstairs." Arturo led Lydia to a heavy steel elevator that descended deep beneath the bedrock of Manhattan. When the doors opened, they stepped into a steel-plated corridor that ended in a massive circular vault door. It looked like something built to withstand a nuclear blast. Arturo spun a heavy chromium dial, and with a deep hydraulic hiss, the multi-ton door swung open. The vault room was lined with thousands of polished brass doors. It was perfectly silent, save for the clicking of Arturo's polished shoes on the tile. He led her down 3 rows until they reached a medium-sized door stamped with the number 804. Your key, please, Arturo said, producing his own silver master key. Lydia retrieved the golden lion-headed key with a trembling hand. They inserted both keys simultaneously and turned. The brass door clicked and popped open. Arturo pulled out a long, heavy steel drawer, carried it to a private viewing room, equipped with a single leather chair and a brass desk lamp, and set it down. "I will leave you to your privacy," Arturo said, bowing slightly before pulling the heavy privacy door shut behind him. Lydia was alone. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of aged leather and dry paper, and lifted the lid of the steel drawer. Inside rested a beautiful cracked leather folio. Embossed on the cover in fading gold leaf were the words, "The Carnegie Ledger, 1918. Lydia opened it. The first few pages were handwritten logs of stock transfers, but as she turned deeper into the folio, her jaw dropped. Stacked neatly inside were rows of pristine vintage bearer bonds. They were issued by the Pennsylvania Railroad and the United States Treasury in the 1920s. Unlike modern digital stocks, bearer bonds belonged entirely to whoever physically held them, and there were hundreds of them. Tucked beneath the thick stacks of bonds was a modern manila envelope. Lydia opened it to find a warranty deed. It wasn't for a house. It was the underlying land lease for a massive 30-story commercial skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. Beatrice didn't just own a home. She owned the very concrete and steel that major corporations paid millions in rent to occupy every single month. Lydia pulled out her phone and did a frantic rough calculation of the bearer bonds' face value and accrued interest over a century, combined with the estimated value of the Midtown land lease. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just millions. It was close to $80 million. A fitting prize. A cold, familiar voice echoed through the small room. Lydia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway of the private viewing room, flanked by a tall, shark-eyed lawyer in a bespoke suit, was her Uncle William. William Harrington stepped into the cramped viewing room, looking entirely out of place in his tailored Italian cashmere coat. His smug, aristocratic face was contorted into a victorious sneer. He glanced dismissively at the leather folio, then at the stacks of antique bonds. A glint of sheer, unadulterated greed flashed in his eyes. "How did you find me?" Lydia demanded, instinctively stepping between William and the steel drawer. William chuckled a dry, rasping sound. "You really think you're clever, Lydia? When Abernathy told me you actually took that rusty piece of garbage home, I knew Beatrice was playing a game. She always loved her little theatrics. I simply hired a private investigator to sit outside your pathetic apartment. When you practically sprinted to the train station this morning, clutching your bag like it held the Holy Grail, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together." The lawyer stepped forward, snapping open a sleek leather briefcase. "Miss Jenkins, I am Mr. Vance, legal counsel for the Harrington estate. You are currently in possession of assets that legally belong to the primary estate." "That's a lie." Lydia shot back, her hands balling into fists. "The will explicitly stated that I inherit the iron box and its contents. The key was the content." "A cute argument," Mr. Vance replied smoothly, pulling out a thick legal document. "However, the will also dictates that Mr. William Harrington inherits all liquid assets and primary financial holdings. A safety deposit box at a bank falls under the umbrella of the estate's financial holdings. The key is merely a tool. The assets themselves belong to your uncle. If you attempt to leave this room with those bonds, we will have you arrested for grand larceny." William smiled warmly, though his eyes were dead. "Step aside, Lydia. You had your little adventure. I'll even write you a check for $10,000. You can finally pay off that cheap car of yours." Lydia felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. They had the money, the power, and the lawyers. She was just a freelance designer from Somerville. She looked down at the Carnegie Ledger, her eyes blurring with tears of frustration. Was this it? Had Beatrice sent her on a wild goose chase, only to have William snatch the prize at the finish line? But as Lydia looked down, her eyes caught the bottom of the manila envelope that had held the property deed. There was another piece of paper inside a thick sheet of legal parchment, with a red wax seal, identical to the one she had found in the iron box. Lydia pulled it out. The heading read, "Irrevocable Delidiation of the Constance Whitney Blind Trust." She scanned the document, her heart pounding faster with every word. Suddenly the panic evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure electric triumph. Lydia looked up at her uncle, a slow, sharp smile spreading across her face. "You didn't read Beatrice's private ledgers, did you, William?" Lydia asked, her voice echoing with newfound authority. William frowned, his smug facade cracking slightly. "What are you talking about?" "This account," Lydia said, holding up the parchment, "isn't part of the Harrington estate. It never was. It's a blind trust established in 1985 under the pseudonym Constance Whitney. And according to this document, notarized by a federal judge, the sole irrevocable beneficiary of this trust is the physical holder of the Lionhead key." Mr. Vance scoffed. "A technicality. We will tie this up in probate court for a decade." "You won't," a new voice interrupted. Arturo Pendleton, the senior vault manager, stepped into the room. His mild demeanor was gone. He looked like a general defending his fortress. "Mr. Harrington, I must ask you and your counsel to step away from my client." "Your client," William spat. "That money belongs to my family." "That money," Arturo corrected coldly, "belongs to the Constance Whitney Trust. The Manhattan Historical Trust manages this account independently of the Harrington estate. Mrs. Jenkins has satisfied our security protocols. Furthermore, if you attempt to contest this in court, you will trigger the poison pill clause Ms. Harrington meticulously drafted." Lydia's eyes darted to Arturo, then back to the paper in her hand. She flipped to the second page and read the clause Arturo was referring to aloud. Should William Harrington attempt to lay claim to the Constance Whitney Trust, the executor is instructed to release the financial audits of the primary offshore accounts directly to the Internal Revenue Service. William's face drained of color. He looked as though he had been struck by lightning. "What offshore accounts?" Mr. Vance asked, looking nervously at his client. Lydia finally understood the depth of Beatrice's genius. "The primary offshore trust," Lydia said, her voice dripping with the same condescension William had used during the will reading. "The one you inherited yesterday, William. Beatrice didn't just leave you the estate. She left you the debt. She leveraged the Harrington assets to the absolute breaking point to purchase the Midtown land lease and hid the tax liabilities in the offshore shell company you just legally claimed as your own." William took a staggering step back, bumping into the brass doorway. No, she couldn't have. The taxes on that. It would be millions. It would bankrupt me. "It seems," Lydia said carefully, packing the bearer bonds, the deed and the ledger into her leather satchel, "that Beatrice knew exactly what you were capable of managing, Mr." Vance, realizing his client was essentially a walking financial corpse, quietly snapped his briefcase shut and stepped out into the hallway, abandoning William entirely. William stared at Lydia, his mouth opening and closing, stripped of his arrogance, his wealth and his power. He was nothing but a hollow man standing in the ruins of a trap he had eagerly walked into. "Arturo," Lydia said politely, slinging her now heavy satchel over her shoulder, "could you kindly escort my uncle out of the building? I believe he has a flight to London to catch, or perhaps a meeting with his accountants." "With pleasure, Ms. Jenkins," Arturo replied, gesturing toward the elevator. Lydia walked out of the private viewing room, her boots clicking confidently against the marble floor of the vault. She didn't look back. She thought of the rusted iron box sitting on her cheap linoleum floor in Boston, the brilliant decoy that had changed her life. She was going to pay off her mother's medical debts by the end of the week. After that, the world was hers. They had laughed at her cheap inheritance, but as Lydia stepped out of the Manhattan Historical Trust and into the bright, crisp New York sunlight, she was the only one smiling. Did you love this story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure? If Lydia's brilliant victory over her greedy uncle made you smile, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life inspired drama with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping stories of secrets, wealth, and sweet justice every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you do with $80 million? See you in the next video.